Cenk Uygur had a sit-down interview with Bernie Sanders in Houston, and there were some topics that I thought were super fascinating, including a very vulnerable moment that Bernie Sanders had in response to the attacks he's dealing with in the corporate media. Take a look.
There's nonstop attacks against you, and I kind of assumed that you were used to it. But you're a human being, and all they do is attack you. And you know, there's this famous, now infamous segment on MSNBC where the woman says that you make her physically ill, etc. How do you feel about it? How does it affect you personally?
It hurts. I mean, I'm like, you're right. I am a human being. I'm used to it. We understand that we are taking on the system, and the system is the Democratic establishment. You know, the system is the corporate media. So I'm not gonna. You know, it's not only the attacks, I'll tell you what's even worse. In fact, there have been instances where the polling numbers have been up on the wall and I'm ignored, where we're doing well. You know, it's like there's an attempt to make our views invisible for the exact reason that you said. They are popular views. But the idea that we can take on the insurance companies that have healthcare for all, the idea that we can take on the drug companies, the idea that we can take on Wall Street, is that even within the realm of discussion? You got 6 financial institutions that have assets equivalent to half of the GDP of America. Do you think that's an issue we might want to talk about? The need to break up the banks so they don't do what they did 11 years ago? All right. So what it's more than the attacks is the attempt often by the mainstream media to kind of make us invisible, that our issues are not important. I am not important. I'm not going to tell you that that does not hurt. It does.
I thought that was a great answer because a lot of people, myself included, sometimes forget in the heat of the moment that the people that we're having discussions about are, at the end of the day, people. Mm-hmm. And I don't consider Trump part of that equation. He is just so incredibly cruel and divisive that
disconnected.
Yeah. But you know, just for the purposes of the Democratic primary, you know, these are people who do have emotions, who do have their vulnerable moments. And, you know, every time I watch these debates, I mean, even last night, the exchange between Julian Castro and Joe Biden, the stuff about Biden's memory, like it made me a little uncomfortable, even though I think policy is fair game, go at it, you know, you get passionate about it. Like the personal attacks, you get it from other candidates, but the media is just insane these days.
Well, it's counterproductive too, because I even had that critique one time of like Buttigieg, even when I was like, all of these like cute little jabs that are kind of ageist, be very careful, because most of the people who are actually turning up at the polls, like who are voting, are that same demographic. And so like when we take these kind of like, I know like in the moment it's very like entertainment based, but really being mindful of who it is that you hope to represent and being sensitive to those narratives and those experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. And you know, Bernie is also somebody who's taken the ageist jabs too. What I love about what he said was that it wasn't necessarily about him. It was about how corporate media is delegitimizing the concerns of the population that he is representing, which is a significant portion of Americans. And what you know, Cenk was talking about too, is they don't understand what it means to be a populist candidate, to support the vision and the desire of a big majority of people makes him popular, and to discredit that by throwing up a poll that shows that he's far from the top shows or is insinuating that people who appreciate or are invested in Bernie's vision, their issues and desires don't matter either, and they're a far shot from the top.
But that's why one of the biggest thumbs up that I saw of the night it was toward Elizabeth Warren. They were assessing her strategy in in all of the debates so far. Whenever someone would kind of make a jab or like say something, she hasn't responded. She goes right back into talking about minus when she was like, if you're not going to like think about how you can change things, why even run for president or like that kind of, other than that, which was very matter of fact, right? Like, that wasn't anything that was like attacking their personhood or any of that. But I do think that there has to be, for someone to take on Trump, they're going to have that resilience, like that extra something that's like, you know what? I know what this is. I see what it is. I cannot break my focus.
Right.
I can't internalize this, and I have to be head on with this.
Yeah.
And I think that I don't know that there's been a presidency, like a race, even like
anything
this
like
before.
this. Yeah, you're right. And I love the point that you made about how it's not necessarily about him, it's about the message being minimized and belittled and brushed under the rug, neglected. And imagine, I mean, you see how certain candidates are rising in the polls. You see how the message from progressive candidates like Bernie Sanders is really resonating with the voters. And to see corporate media just completely ignore that. It's not just ignoring the candidate, it is ignoring the entire movement, which consists of so many people who want real change in this country. So how does he get his message out, right? There seems to be this dismissive nature toward progressive candidates in the mainstream media. And if there's a media blackout, how do you effectively get your message out as a candidate? He talks about that in this next clip.
How do you get to the American people when there's this wall between you and the message you're trying to get out? And that wall is the media saying, honestly, an alternate reality, like Kellyanne Conway talks about.
Right, Jake, I mean, this is clearly one of the problems that we're having. You know, I don't mean to be overly dramatic here. We are taking on the entire system. That's what we're doing. And I'm not a child, and believe me, my wife and I talked about whether we want to run for months up and down. Should I do it? We understand. It's not surprising. We are, you know, from the corporate media's perspective, it's not only negative stuff. It's often making us look invisible. We're not there. And it's, I'm not going to tell you that it's not hurtful and it's not difficult, but the corporate media is part of the problem. So the way we do it is we have, I think, by far the strongest social media presence of any progressive candidate, any Democratic candidate. And by the way, Donald Trump is nobody's fool. He is incredibly strong on social media. With 60 million people on Twitter. I mean, that's just extraordinary. And we appeal to the progressive media like yourself, Tom Hoffman, and other people.
And I really do respect that, because both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have made a point to not only try to spread their message through traditional media, but they immediately go to independent news sources such as the Young Turks. I know that Bernie Sanders just had an interview with Kyle Kulinski. I mean, it's so important to kind of break through and break out of the traditional media model, because so many young people have cut the cord and they don't rely on cable news for their information. They do go online, they do go to social media. So I love the fact that they're savvy enough to, you know, not necessarily bypass, but if there is a media blackout when it comes to corporate press, they're like, well, there's a giant audience waiting for us in new media. And
well, also doing it like the old school way by pitch and carry, or like, you know, actually showing up. That was one of the most attractive qualities about Warren's campaign that I loved more than anything. First of all, I felt really ashamed of myself. I was like, this woman is like twice my, and is out there working it, wearing it out. She's standing in these long lines, taking photos with everyone who wants to take one. And at first, by first glance, you're like, okay, we get it. Like, she's trying to appeal to social media selfies and all that. It's that one-on-one interaction. And one of the main reasons why I met with most of the candidates before I made an endorsement was because I knew that there is something indescribable about sitting across from another human being, looking them in their eyes and receiving the energy and the promise from them directly that sticks with you. And so the answer to that is, when you can't break through to like corporate media, you definitely rely on the Young Turks and independent media in general, but you also hit the ground running. And we saw them, Warren's team do that in Kermit, West Virginia. We saw them in like Iowa, all of these smaller places.
Right. One thing I wanted to just quickly add to buttress that point is, you know, there was a story recently about how many of the Democratic candidates who had taken a pledge to avoid big dollar donors and all that, they've given up because they realized, all right, there was like an initial burst of small dollar donors, but our campaigns kind of fizzled out. We're not able to raise any money through this process anymore. So now they're going back to the old model. They're going to fundraisers. And what's fascinating about that, and Jeff Weaver made this point. Jeff Weaver is a longtime political advisor for Bernie Sanders. He said, look, when candidates aren't taking these big dollar donors and they're not going to these major fundraising events, they have time to go to rallies. They have time to connect with the voters, right? They have time to take the selfies, have these conversations. And I think that goes a long way in appealing to the Democratic base, because they're not just talking, they're not just throwing policy out there and expecting people to figure it out for themselves. They're actually trying to connect with the voters. I think that's so important.
Yeah, and while a strong digital game and digital organizing is powerful, you saw what happened with Obama, but Obama took, big money as well. 2008, but a strong ground game is actually how you connect to voters on the ground. Mm-hmm. So you know the concerns and you're invested in the stories that you hear. And Elizabeth Warren is somebody who has been on like 5 programs in one day, and Bernie Sanders is somebody who's been out walking a lot of his media train around him, 3 miles ahead of them. And so these folks who are in their, is she 70? I think she's 70, right? Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah, she just turned 70, yeah.
These folks in their 70s are outpacing everybody else.
It's amazing.
I'm shook. Like, she's actually like on the ground, like not and doing programs and traveling.
Right.
Like, even when they had to be down in Florida, she went to the encampment to actually see what was going on. Like, there's just I think at the end of the day, we're seeing more value in social capital over monetary capital.
Yes.
And it's like, I appreciate that she's not doing big fundraisers with billionaires and doing all of that. We talked about this before, Anna and I, that in the general, that's a whole different story, because it's like we need to be able to beat Trump. But I think right now, this is the moment where we connect with the actual voters.
Yeah, and I do want to eventually have a longer discussion about that strategy, because I am worried that if she makes it to the general, it might turn some voters off. I'm talking about progressive voters who really don't want to see the money influence our candidate, but that's a different discussion.
The TYT Plus app is now available on iOS and Android. Download to get more TYT content at tyt.com/app.